The sentence didn't come with trumpets. No palace announcement. No coordinated press release. Just 6 words that, according to multiple insiders, hit like a grenade behind closed doors. I am divorcing Meghan. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let that sit for a second. Because if those words are real, and the people closest to the situation insist they are, then everything the public thought it knew about this marriage was already over long before anyone outside the room caught on. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you saw Prince Harry look truly at peace? Not smiling for a camera, not laughing on a stage, not delivering lines polished by a PR team. Actually at peace. Most people can't remember. And that matters more than you think. This story isn't just about a divorce rumor. It's about timing, silence, pressure, and a slow emotional collapse that insiders say has been unfolding in plain sight while the world was distracted by headlines, lawsuits, documentaries, and carefully curated appearances. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: royal marriages don't just end. They unravel, quietly, methodically, and usually long before the public is invited to notice. So why now? Why would Harry, a man who walked away from the monarchy to protect his family, suddenly be the one allegedly preparing to walk away from his marriage? And why does everyone who's paying close attention keep saying the same thing? This didn't happen overnight. Let's rewind. Not to the wedding, not to the fairy tale beginning. Those images have been dissected to death. Let's rewind to the moment things stopped being performative and started becoming personal. Because according to people who've watched this from the inside, the warning signs weren't loud. They were subtle. And that's what made them dangerous. Shorter tempers, longer silences, decisions made without consultation. Harry didn't suddenly wake up one day and decide he was done. He reached a point where, allegedly, he couldn't recognize his own life anymore. And if that sounds dramatic, ask yourself something. What happens when a man who has spent his entire life being told who he is finally realizes he doesn't know who he's become? That's the question at the center of this story. Because what's unfolding here isn't just a marriage breakdown. It's an identity crisis playing out on a global stage. And the timing couldn't be worse. Public support is fractured. Media goodwill is thin. Legal battles have drained emotional and financial reserves. At the same time, the monarchy itself is undergoing a quiet reset. Fewer working royals, sharper boundaries, less tolerance for chaos. Harry is standing at the intersection of all of it. And according to insiders, the pressure has been unbearable. Here's where things get interesting. People close to the situation say the alleged announcement didn't come during a fight. It came after one. A long one. The kind of argument that doesn't end with raised voices, but with exhaustion. The kind where both sides realize they're repeating the same sentences for the 100th time. Have you ever been in that kind of relationship moment where you're not angry anymore? You're just tired. That's the emotional state multiple sources describe Harry being in. Tired of fighting narratives, tired of defending decisions he didn't fully believe in, tired of feeling like every move had to serve a brand rather than a life. And that exhaustion matters, because exhaustion changes people. It lowers defenses. It makes truths harder to avoid. According to one former associate, Harry started asking questions he'd never asked before. Why am I doing this? Who is this really for? What happens if I stop? Those are dangerous questions when you've built your entire public identity on defiance and loyalty. Especially loyalty. Harry has always been loyal to a fault. To his mother's memory. To his brother, until he wasn't. To his wife, until, allegedly, something cracked. And that crack didn't come from the outside. It came from within. Here's a contradiction that insiders keep circling back to. Harry left the royal family to escape control. But over time, some say he felt more controlled than ever. Controlled by schedules, controlled by optics, controlled by expectations that had nothing to do with his own happiness. Isn't that ironic? The man who wanted freedom found himself in another gilded cage, just a different one. Now, let's be clear about something. None of this means there wasn't love. There was. Fierce love, defiant love. But love doesn't survive everything. It doesn't survive when two people stop hearing each other. It doesn't survive when every disagreement becomes public currency. And it doesn't survive when one partner feels like their identity has been subsumed by the relationship itself. According to people who were once welcome in their inner circle, Harry began pulling back in subtle ways. Fewer spontaneous decisions, less enthusiasm for joint appearances, more time alone. Not dramatic enough for headlines, but noticeable if you were paying attention. And some were, because behind the scenes, the mood had shifted. Where there was once a shared sense of mission, there was now friction. Where there was once unity against the world, there were now disagreements about how that world should be confronted. Ask yourself this: what happens when a marriage is built on fighting a common enemy, and that enemy starts to fade? What's left? According to insiders, that's when the cracks widened. Harry started questioning strategies, questioning messaging, questioning whether constant conflict was actually healing or just addictive. And here's the emotional beat most people miss. Harry didn't just lose his family when he left the monarchy. He lost a sense of grounding, structure, routine, a clear role. Love filled that gap for a while. So did purpose. But purpose, tied to outrage, has a shelf life. Eventually, it eats you. Those closest to Harry say he reached a point where he felt he was constantly reacting, never living. Every decision filtered through potential backlash. Every silence interpreted as strategy. Every smile scrutinized for authenticity. That wears on a person, especially someone who already carries unresolved grief. And here's where this story stops being speculative and starts becoming deeply human. People say Harry began expressing fear, not anger, not resentment, but fear. Fear of becoming someone his younger self wouldn't recognize. Fear of repeating patterns he swore he'd break. Fear that his children would grow up in an atmosphere of constant tension. Yes, the children. Because while the public argues about titles and optics, the real conversations were allegedly happening behind closed doors, late at night, when the cameras were gone. What kind of life are we building? Where will the kids grow up? What values are we actually modeling? These aren't abstract questions. They're the questions that either save a marriage or end it. And according to insiders, these questions didn't bring clarity. They brought division. Not because either side was wrong, but because they wanted different futures. And that's the hardest truth to accept. You can love someone deeply and still be moving in opposite directions. So when those 6 words were allegedly spoken, "I am divorcing Meghan," they weren't impulsive. They were the culmination of months, maybe years of quiet emotional erosion. But here's the part that shocked even seasoned observers. The announcement, insiders say, wasn't meant for the public. Not yet. It was said privately, deliberately, almost clinically, as if Harry needed to hear the words out loud to believe them himself. And that moment, when intention turns into language, is terrifying. Because once you say it, you can't unsay it. And that's where we need to pause. Because what came next wasn't a legal filing. It wasn't a public statement. It wasn't even a fight. It was silence. A long one. The kind of silence that signals something irreversible has begun. And according to multiple sources, that silence didn't just change the marriage. It changed how everyone around them started behaving. Friends stopped calling. Advisors grew cautious. Conversations became guarded. Because once the word divorce enters the room, everything shifts, and what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Did you notice how fast the silence spread? That's always the tell. Not the shouting, not the tears, not even the leaked whispers. Silence. Because silence means people are recalibrating, choosing words carefully, deciding which side of history they might soon be standing on. That silence is where Chapter 1 truly begins. Because once those words were allegedly spoken, once the idea of divorce stopped being theoretical and became real, something subtle but unmistakable shifted in Harry's world. And the first people to feel it weren't the public. They were the ones who'd been closest for years. Advisors, old friends, former allies who'd stuck around long after the spotlight turned harsh. They all described the same thing. Harry didn't look angry, he looked resolved. And that scared people more than rage ever could. Here's why. Anger is emotional. Anger can pass. Anger can be redirected. Resolution is quiet. Resolution is dangerous. Resolution means someone has already done the grieving. Ask yourself this: how many marriages end at the moment someone says, "I'm done"? And how many actually ended months earlier when one person stopped trying? According to insiders, Harry didn't stop caring. He stopped arguing. And that difference matters, because arguing means you still believe something can change. Silence means you've accepted that it won't. People close to the situation say the shift became noticeable in small, almost invisible ways. Harry stopped pushing back in meetings, stopped rewriting statements late at night, stopped obsessing over optics. He began delegating things he used to control personally. That may sound minor. It wasn't, because for years, Harry had been deeply involved in every narrative decision, every word, every frame. Now, he was pulling away. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, methodically. And that behavior set off quiet alarms. One former associate described it this way: it was like watching someone pack emotionally without touching a suitcase. Think about that image for a moment. You're still physically present, still showing up, still playing the role. But internally, you've already left. That's the state multiple sources describe Harry being in during this phase. And it explains something else the public couldn't quite put their finger on: why his energy felt different. He was still polite, still composed, still saying the right things. But the spark, the urgency, the fire was gone. And that absence spoke volumes to people who knew him well, because Harry has always been driven by emotion, by instinct, by passion, by reaction. A calm, withdrawn Harry isn't at peace. He's bracing. So what triggered this emotional withdrawal? That's where accounts begin to overlap. There wasn't one explosive moment. There was accumulation. Small disagreements that never fully resolved, big decisions that left lingering resentment, a growing sense that every path forward required one person to shrink. And according to insiders, Harry increasingly felt like that person was him. Let's talk about identity for a second. Harry has lived his entire life under labels: spare, rebel, traumatized prince, protector, defector. Every phase of his life has been defined by what he stood against the press, against palace control, against inherited expectations. But here's the uncomfortable pivot. At some point, people say Harry began wondering what he actually stood for, not symbolically, not rhetorically. Personally, what did he want when no one was watching? When no message needed to be sent? When no statement needed to land? Those questions don't usually show up in happy marriages. They show up when someone feels lost. And being lost inside a high-profile marriage is uniquely suffocating. Because there's nowhere to disappear, every move becomes speculation. Every pause becomes a headline. Every facial expression becomes evidence. So Harry did the only thing he could. He withdrew inward, and that withdrawal didn't go unnoticed. People around the couple describe an emotional asymmetry developing. One partner pushing forward, the other slowing down. One focused on momentum, the other craving stillness. That dynamic can be fatal, because it turns every decision into a tug of war. Where do we live? What do we say next? What's the next project? What's the next fight? And eventually, someone lets go of the rope. According to insiders, Harry did. Not publicly, not defiantly, internally. Here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Harry didn't just feel pressure from one direction. He felt trapped between worlds that no longer fully wanted him. The monarchy had moved on. Hollywood was transactional. Public sympathy was conditional. And the marriage, once his refuge, had become another arena of expectation. That's a brutal realization. Because when your sanctuary becomes another performance, exhaustion follows fast. Sources say Harry began expressing something he rarely voiced before: regret. Not about love, about pace. He allegedly questioned whether everything had moved too fast. The marriage, the exit, the battles, the exposure. That doesn't mean he wanted to rewind time. It means he was finally processing the cost. And processing the cost often leads to reckoning. Here's an emotional contradiction insiders highlight. Harry is deeply loyal, but he's also deeply sensitive to feeling unheard. When those two traits collide, something breaks. And according to multiple people, what broke wasn't the relationship first. It was Harry's sense of agency. He began feeling like decisions were happening around him rather than with him. That's poison to someone who already spent a lifetime being directed. And when that poison accumulates, it doesn't explode, it numbs. That numbness explains why when the word divorce was allegedly spoken, it wasn't dramatic. It was calm, almost detached, as if Harry was observing himself from a distance, saying words he'd rehearsed internally for months. And that detachment terrified the people who heard about it. Because detached decisions are rarely reversible. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Did Meghan see this coming? Accounts differ. Some say she noticed the emotional distance and tried to course correct. Others say the distance itself created more conflict. What everyone agrees on is this: communication changed. Where there used to be long conversations, there were now short exchanges. Where there used to be shared strategy, there were now parallel plans. That's not a marriage in crisis. That's a marriage already splitting in two, and the people closest to them felt it. They described gatherings that felt tense, moments where one person would leave the room and the energy would shift instantly. You've felt that before, haven't you? That awkward quiet, when everyone pretends not to notice something is wrong. That was happening more often. But still, nothing was public. No leaks, no confirmation. Just that silence. And silence in royal-adjacent circles is never accidental. It's strategic. It buys time. Time to decide what comes next. Time to prepare for impact. Because once a story like this breaks, it can't be controlled. And here's where Chapter 1 reaches its sharpest edge. According to multiple sources, the alleged statement, "I am divorcing Meghan," was followed by something far more telling. Harry didn't ask for advice. He didn't seek reassurance. He didn't float the idea. He stated it. That alone signals finality. People who know Harry say when he asks questions, he's still unsure. When he makes statements, he's already decided. And this was a statement, so what did the people around him do? They panicked. Not because divorce is unheard of, but because of timing. Because of optics. Because of what this would unleash. Advisors reportedly urged caution, suggested pauses, recommended framing alternatives. Harry listened and then did nothing. No immediate filing, no press strategy, no damage control, just more silence. And that silence did something else. It invited speculation from the inside out. People began whispering, sides began forming, loyalties began shifting. Because once divorce is on the table, everyone starts protecting themselves. And that's when things get messy. Because the moment people start protecting themselves, information starts moving. Quietly, carefully, and not always with good intentions. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear to everyone involved. Whatever was coming next wasn't going to be clean. It wasn't going to be quiet. And it wasn't going to be containable. Because when a royal marriage fractures at this level, it doesn't just affect two people. It affects reputations, institutions, narratives that have been carefully built for years. And someone, somewhere, was already preparing for the fallout. But what no one anticipated was who would make the next move, and why that move would stun the UK long before any announcement ever reached the public. Before anyone outside the inner circle sensed trouble, something far more dangerous had already taken hold. The fights were changing. Not louder, not more frequent. Different. And that difference is what made them impossible to fix. Because early arguments are messy, emotional. Charged with hope, they end with slammed doors and apologies and promises to do better. These didn't. These ended quietly, with unfinished sentences, with one person talking and the other already somewhere else. That's when people who know relationships well start to worry. Because a marriage doesn't collapse when two people fight, it collapses when one of them stops believing the fight is worth having. This is where chapter 2 truly begins. Not with scandal, not with betrayal, but with erosion, slow, subtle, relentless. According to multiple people who observed the couple privately, disagreements that once felt situational started becoming philosophical. Not, what should we do next, but why are we doing this at all? That's a terrifying pivot. Because you can negotiate plans, you can compromise on schedules, you can even survive disagreements about money or location. But when the argument becomes about purpose, you're no longer arguing about a marriage. You're arguing about identity. And that's where things began to crack. Harry had always framed his decisions as reactions. Reaction to grief, reaction to pressure, reaction to perceived injustice. But over time, some say he began to realize he was still reacting, just in a different direction, still defined by opposition, still living in resistance mode. Only now, the resistance wasn't against the palace. It was against his own life. That realization didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. A project that didn't feel fulfilling. A public appearance that left him hollow instead of energized. A victory that felt strangely empty. Have you ever achieved something you thought would make everything click, and instead felt nothing? That emptiness is destabilizing. And when you can't explain it, you start looking for reasons. Sources say Harry didn't initially blame the marriage. He blamed exhaustion, burnout, the press. But exhaustion fades. Burnout recovers. This didn't. So the questions grew sharper. Why does every disagreement feel like a negotiation for control? Why does every compromise feel one-sided? Why do I feel more anxious now than I ever did before? Those questions don't come from resentment. They come from confusion. And confusion, when it goes unresolved, becomes distance. People close to the situation describe an emotional imbalance emerging. One partner, driven by momentum, the other, craving pause. One energized by attention, the other, depleted by it. That mismatch doesn't mean either person is wrong, but it does mean they're out of sync. And once sync is lost, even small issues feel massive. A scheduling change becomes a power struggle. A disagreement over wording becomes a referendum on trust. A boundary request becomes an accusation. That's when cracks stop being cosmetic. They become structural. Here's something rarely discussed publicly. Harry didn't just feel pressure from his wife or the media. He felt pressure from the version of himself he'd sold to the world. The protector, the rebel, the man who chose love over legacy. That identity came with expectations. He wasn't allowed to falter, wasn't allowed to doubt, wasn't allowed to say, I don't know if this is working. Because if he did, what would that say about the sacrifices he'd already made? That kind of psychological trap is brutal, because admitting doubt doesn't just threaten the marriage, it threatens the narrative. And narratives are hard to abandon when they've become your armor. So instead of voicing doubt openly, Harry internalized it. An internalized doubt doesn't dissipate. It corrodes. People say the fights started following a pattern. Harry would raise a concern. It would be reframed as external pressure. He'd be encouraged to stay the course. At first, that reassurance felt supportive. Later, it felt dismissive. Because reassurance only works when it addresses the fear beneath the concern. And his fear wasn't about optics. It was about losing himself. That's the emotional beat most observers miss. Harry wasn't afraid of public backlash. He'd survived worse. He was afraid of waking up 10 years later and realizing he'd traded one form of captivity for another. That fear doesn't scream, it whispers. And whispers are easy to ignore, until they're not. As this dynamic played out, communication shifted again. Not just less talking, different talking. Conversations became strategic instead of intimate, planned instead of spontaneous, outcome-focused instead of exploratory. That's a sign therapists often point to. When partners stop trying to understand each other and start trying to manage each other, something fundamental has broken. Insiders say Harry felt increasingly managed, managed by schedules, managed by advisors, managed by expectations, wrapped in reassurance. And being managed is a trigger for someone with his history, because he'd spent his childhood being managed by an institution that never asked how he felt. That parallel, whether intentional or not, hit hard. And when he tried to articulate that discomfort, the response wasn't malicious. It was pragmatic. Focus on the mission. Ignore the noise. Push forward. But Harry wasn't exhausted by noise. He was exhausted by motion. Always moving, always reacting, always fighting something. At some point, he wanted stillness, and stillness felt impossible within the structure his life had taken. That tension showed up in arguments about seemingly minor things. How many appearances to do, which battles to pick, when to retreat instead of advance. One side saw retreat as weakness, the other saw it as survival. Those are incompatible perspectives. And when neither side feels truly heard, frustration turns inward. People noticed Harry becoming more withdrawn after disagreements, not sulking, processing. But processing without resolution is just rumination, and rumination feeds doubt. According to one person who interacted with him regularly, Harry began using phrases that raised eyebrows. I don't know who this is for anymore. I feel like I'm always on. I just want it to be quiet. Those aren't statements of anger. They're statements of depletion. And depletion is dangerous in a marriage that relies on intensity, because intensity can mask incompatibility for a long time. Until it can't. Another contradiction insiders point to is this. Harry is deeply empathetic, but empathy without boundaries leads to self-erasure. For years, he'd framed compromise as love, but somewhere along the way, compromise started to feel like disappearance. And that's when the emotional stakes shifted. He wasn't asking for change. He was asking for space. And space is threatening when a relationship has been built on unity against the world. Because if one person steps back, the entire structure wobbles. That wobble reportedly triggered more tension. Attempts to re-engage, attempts to realign, attempts to reassert shared purpose. But those attempts often miss the mark. Because Harry didn't want more purpose. He wanted peace. And peace isn't something you can schedule. Here's another uncomfortable layer. Harry had begun reflecting on his past with a clarity he hadn't allowed himself before. Not just his mother's death, but the way unresolved grief shaped his choices. The way trauma bonds can feel like destiny. The way saving someone can become a substitute for saving yourself. Those reflections didn't accuse anyone. They implicated him. And that's heavy, because realizing you participated in your own unraveling is harder than blaming someone else. People close to him say that's when his demeanor changed most noticeably. Less reactive, more contemplative, almost mournful, as if he were grieving something that hadn't officially ended yet. That kind of pre-grief is telling. It means a decision is forming beneath consciousness, and once that decision reaches the surface, it feels sudden to everyone else. But to the person living it, it feels overdue. That's why the alleged statement about divorce didn't come during peak conflict. It came during a lull, after exhaustion, after repetition, after hope had quietly drained away. And that timing is critical, because decisions made in calm despair are harder to reverse than decisions made in anger. Now, let's talk about perception. From the outside, the marriage still looked intact. Projects continued. Appearances happened. Statements were issued, but inside, people describe a relationship operating on momentum rather than connection. Moving because stopping felt too frightening. That's not sustainable. Eventually, momentum crashes into reality, and when it does, it leaves wreckage. Harry began taking more time alone. Not dramatically, but intentionally. Walks, private trips, long periods of quiet. Those moments weren't escapes, they were audits. Audits of his life, his choices, his future. According to sources, Harry didn't want to leave. He wanted to breathe. But breathing required stepping away. And stepping away meant acknowledging what no one wanted to say out loud. That love, on its own, wasn't enough anymore. And that realization more than any argument, is what cracked everything open. Because once you accept that love isn't enough, the entire foundation shifts. You stop negotiating details, you start questioning the structure, and that's when the word divorce stops being taboo. It becomes logical. But logic in matters of the heart is terrifying because it strips away romantic justification. It forces honesty, and honesty doesn't care about optics, which brings us to the moment that changed how everyone around them started behaving. According to multiple insiders, Harry didn't just express doubt to one person. He expressed it to several, separately, quietly. That's significant because when someone voices the same concern to different people in isolation, it's not venting, it's confirmation. Confirmation that the thought is real, that it's no longer fleeting, and once that thought exists, it spreads. Not publicly, internally. People begin preparing for outcomes they don't yet name. Advisors start calculating scenarios. Friends start guarding their words. Conversations become cautious because everyone senses something is coming, but no one knows when or how or who will control the story. And that uncertainty is where power starts to shift because the person who controls timing controls narrative. And according to those closest to the situation, Harry was quietly taking back control, not by speaking louder, by speaking less, letting others reveal themselves, letting dynamics surface, letting truth clarify. And that calm observation phase is often the final stage before action, which leads us to the most unsettling realization of all. By the time the marriage's cracks became visible to insiders, Harry had already accepted the possibility of walking away. He just hadn't decided how. And the next chapter isn't about arguments. It's about strategy. Because once acceptance sets in, the question stops being, can this be saved? It becomes, what happens next? And the answer to that question would set off a chain reaction no one was prepared for. Especially when the next move didn't come from the person everyone expected. At some point, the room got smaller. Not physically, emotionally. That's how people who were once inside describe it. The conversations felt tighter. The circle felt narrower. The oxygen felt thinner. And that's where Chapter 3 begins. Because while the public was still debating motives and optics, something far more consequential was unfolding quietly in the background. Harry was becoming isolated. Not exiled. Not abandoned. Isolated. And there's a difference. Isolation doesn't require enemies. It happens when connections fray one by one, each for a reasonable reason. A call not returned. A visit postponed. A message left unread. None of it dramatic enough to raise alarms. But together, crippling. People close to the situation say Harry didn't immediately notice it happening. At first, it felt like space. Like breathing room. Like relief. Fewer opinions. Less noise. More quiet. But quiet can turn on you, because quiet forces you to hear your own thoughts. And his thoughts weren't kind. He started realizing how few people he could speak to freely, without agendas, without strategy, without consequence. Every relationship seemed to come with conditions. Say this. Don't say that. Wait until later. Think about the optics. Even vulnerability had to be managed. That's when isolation stops being restful and starts being dangerous. Because humans aren't built to process uncertainty alone, especially not uncertainty about their own lives. So Harry did what many people in his position do. He retreated further. Not outwardly, internally. And that retreat accelerated the problem. Friends who had once been fixtures in his life noticed the shift. He wasn't reaching out. He wasn't venting. He wasn't asking for perspective. He was listening more than he spoke. That might sound healthy. It wasn't, because listening without sharing creates imbalance. People don't know how to respond to silence. They fill it with assumptions. Some assumed he was fine. Others assumed he didn't want input. A few assumed they'd already lost him, so they stepped back. And each step back reinforced the sense that he was on his own. Here's something insiders emphasize. This isolation wasn't imposed. It was self-reinforcing. Harry felt misunderstood, so he withdrew. People sensed withdrawal, so they gave space. Space turned into distance. Distance turned into silence. And silence became the dominant emotional environment. That's when the internal narrative begins to warp. Because when you're isolated, your thoughts don't get tested. They echo. Every doubt grows louder. Every regret feels heavier. Every fear sounds more convincing. And Harry's fears were already well developed. Fear of being trapped. Fear of repeating cycles. Fear of losing himself. Without outside voices to challenge those fears, they began to feel inevitable. One former confidant described it bluntly. He stopped checking his thinking. That's a chilling sentence, because checking your thinking is how you avoid spirals. You say, "Am I overreacting?" You say, "Help me see this another way." You say, "Tell me if I'm wrong." Harry wasn't doing that anymore. Not because he thought he was right, but because he didn't trust that anyone could understand the full picture. That's a lonely place to be, especially when your life is being watched by millions. Another contradiction emerged during this period. Publicly, Harry was surrounded by people. Privately, he felt profoundly alone. Appearances continued. Meetings happened. Events unfolded. But these interactions were transactional. They weren't nourishing. They didn't provide the emotional grounding he needed. And grounding matters when you're facing life-altering decisions. Without it, everything feels unstable. People noticed Harry becoming hyper-observant, watching dynamics, reading reactions, noting who said what and who didn't. That kind of vigilance isn't paranoia, it's self-protection. When someone feels unsupported, they start scanning for threats, and that scanning changes behavior. Harry became more guarded, more careful, more reserved, which ironically made people feel less connected to him. They sensed distance and responded accordingly. Isolation deepened. Now here's where things get especially delicate. Harry's isolation didn't just affect friendships. It affected how he perceived his marriage. Because when you're isolated, your primary relationship carries more weight. Every disagreement feels heavier. Every misunderstanding feels more personal. Every tension feels inescapable. There's no outlet, no buffer. The marriage becomes the entire emotional universe. And if that universe is already strained, the pressure becomes unbearable. Sources say Harry began to feel like there was nowhere to put his doubts, express them, and risk escalation, suppress them, and feel dishonest. That's a no-win scenario. So he did something subtle but telling. He stopped confiding, not just in friends, in anyone. That's when isolation becomes dangerous. Because isolation strips away perspective. It convinces you that your interpretation is the only one. And that's when decisions start forming, without friction, without challenge, without pause. People who noticed this shift tried to re-engage. They asked gentle questions. They offered support without specifics. They left doors open. But Harry didn't walk through them. Not because he didn't care, because he was conserving energy. And that conservation tells you something important. When someone starts conserving emotional energy, they're preparing for something. A confrontation, a departure, a reckoning. Energy conservation is a precursor to action. Insiders say Harry became acutely aware of how little control he felt over his life. And that awareness made him even more inward. Because control, when you lack it externally, becomes an internal obsession. He couldn't control the press. He couldn't control public reaction. He couldn't control other people's narratives. But he could control one thing: his own choices. And that realization was empowering and frightening. Empowering because it restored a sense of agency. Frightening because it forced him to confront what he actually wanted. And what he wanted wasn't clarity. It was relief. Relief from constant vigilance. Relief from perpetual conflict. Relief from feeling like every relationship required performance. Isolation sharpened that desire. Because when you're alone, relief becomes more seductive. You imagine a life with fewer conversations, fewer explanations, fewer battles. You imagine quiet, and quiet starts to feel like salvation. But here's the paradox. The quieter Harry became, the more people around him assumed he was coping. Silence reads as strength, especially in public figures. People think he's handling it. He's processing. He doesn't need us. So support receded further. This wasn't cruelty. It was misinterpretation. And misinterpretation can be as damaging as malice. Harry's internal world grew louder as the external world quieted. And in that internal world, certain thoughts began to crystallize. Thoughts like, what if staying is more harmful than leaving? What if loyalty to others has come at the expense of loyalty to myself? What if the bravest thing isn't enduring, but choosing differently? Those thoughts don't arrive fully formed. They evolve, and isolation accelerates their evolution because there's no one to interrupt them. No one to say, let's slow this down. No one to offer an alternative framing. Harry wasn't being egged on. He was being left alone with his conclusions. That's when something else shifted. People say Harry began separating his emotional life into compartments. Public, private, internal. Public remained polished. Private became sparse. Internal became crowded. And crowded internal spaces breed urgency. Because too many unresolved thoughts create pressure. Pressure demands release. That release can take many forms: anger, breakdown, impulsive action, or quiet decision. Harry chose quiet decision, and quiet decisions often blindside everyone else because there's no warning flare, no escalation, just a moment where someone says something definitive, and it feels sudden. But it's not sudden to them, it's overdue. Here's an unsettling detail insiders mention. During this period, Harry started seeking information rather than reassurance. He asked questions about logistics, about timelines, about implications. Not hypotheticals, practicalities. That's a significant shift. People who are unsure seek reassurance. People who are deciding seek information. And Harry was seeking information, indirectly, without declaring intent. That's when those around him began to sense something bigger was coming. Because information seeking changes tone. It becomes less emotional, more detached, more procedural. And that detachment made people nervous because it suggested preparation. Preparation for an outcome that hadn't been named publicly. Now, let's address something uncomfortable. Isolation also changes how you perceive others' motives. Without regular emotional feedback, neutral actions can start to feel manipulative. Advice feels controlling. Concern feels intrusive. Silence feels judgmental. Harry's world became filled with potential misreadings, and those misreadings fed mistrust. Not overt mistrust, quiet suspicion. That suspicion reinforced the sense that he was alone in this. And when someone feels alone, they stop expecting understanding. They stop asking for it. They start acting independently. That's the turning point, because independent action breaks shared narratives. And once shared narratives break, reconciliation becomes much harder. Harry wasn't plotting. He was bracing for backlash. Bracing for fallout, bracing for being misunderstood. Ironically, that bracing posture made misunderstanding more likely, because without communication, people fill gaps with speculation, and speculation spreads, even within tight circles. People began whispering, not maliciously, but cautiously, something's off. He seems different. He's pulling away. Those whispers didn't reach Harry directly, but he felt the change in energy, and that awareness deepened his resolve to keep things contained. Because containment felt safer than exposure. Here's the emotional truth at the center of this chapter. Harry wasn't isolated because no one cared. He was isolated because caring had become complicated. Every relationship came with consequences. Every conversation risked leaks, misinterpretation, or escalation. So he chose silence. But silence, once chosen, takes on a life of its own. It hardens. It isolates. It pushes you toward irreversible choices. By the end of this phase, Harry's emotional world had narrowed dramatically. The marriage felt heavy. Friendships felt distant. Advisors felt cautious. And in that narrowing space, one idea kept resurfacing. What if the only way to stop feeling isolated is to change everything? That's a dangerous thought, because changing everything means breaking something. And breaking something of this magnitude doesn't just affect you. It affects children. It affects reputations. It affects institutions. Harry knew that, which is why he didn't rush. He waited, observed, let the silence do its work. And the silence did work. It clarified what he could no longer tolerate. It stripped away distractions. It forced honesty. And once honesty settles in, action follows. But the action Harry would eventually take wouldn't start with a public announcement. It would start with something far quieter, a private conversation. With someone no one expected. And that conversation would tilt the entire situation in a new direction, because the next chapter isn't about isolation, it's about influence. And how, in moments of vulnerability, the wrong influence, or the right one, can change everything. Money doesn't end marriages, but it exposes them. And that's where chapter 4 begins. Because once Harry's isolation deepened and his inner circle narrowed, another pressure point moved to the foreground. One that had always been present but rarely discussed out loud. Control. Not just emotional control. Not public narrative control. Financial control. And when money intersects with power, marriages don't just strain, they transform. Here's the thing most people misunderstand. This wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about who paid for what. It was about leverage, because in relationships where everything is public, money stops being currency and becomes influence. And influence quietly reshapes decision-making. People close to the situation say, Harry began noticing patterns he hadn't fully acknowledged before. Who signed off on projects? Who decided timing? Who framed success versus failure? At first, those patterns seemed practical. One partner more business-minded, one more emotionally driven. That's common. But over time, Harry started feeling less like a partner and more like an asset. Not intentionally, not maliciously, gradually. And gradual shifts are the most dangerous ones. Because you adapt without realizing what you're adapting to. Harry's life had become a sequence of ventures, productions, appearances, legal battles, statements. Each came with budgets, teams, expectations. And while Harry was often the emotional center of these efforts, he wasn't always the decision maker. That imbalance didn't bother him at first. He trusted. He delegated. He believed shared goals justified uneven roles. But trust requires transparency. And transparency began to feel selective. Sources say Harry started asking questions, not confrontational ones, clarifying ones. Why this deal and not that one? Why now instead of later? Who benefits most from this timing? Those questions weren't accusations. They were curiosity. But curiosity, when it disrupts established power dynamics, is often met with resistance. Not openly, subtly, reassurances, deflections, statements like, this is standard or this is how it's done. At first, Harry accepted those explanations. Later, he began feeling unsettled by them, because standard doesn't always mean fair, and how it's done doesn't always mean aligned. Here's where the emotional undercurrent matters. Harry didn't grow up managing money. He grew up being managed by it. Trusts, allocations, allowances decided by others. When he stepped away from the monarchy, financial independence symbolized freedom, agency, control over his own life. So when that control started feeling diluted again, even unintentionally, it hit a nerve, and that nerve was already raw. People say Harry began feeling like decisions were being optimized for outcomes he didn't fully believe in. Brand positioning, market appeal, audience engagement. Those phrases don't nourish the soul. They serve strategy, and strategy, when it dominates personal life, creates emotional distance. Harry didn't resent ambition. He resented feeling secondary to it. That's a critical distinction, because resentment toward ambition can be worked through. Resentment toward being sidelined erodes trust, and trust, once eroded, doesn't break loudly. It dissolves. One former associate described a moment that stuck with them. Harry allegedly asked, if this stops working, what happens to me? Not financially, Existentially, that question startled people because it suggested Harry was beginning to see himself as interchangeable, as part of a machine that could continue without him. And that's devastating to someone whose identity has already been fractured by public life. The irony? Externally, Harry was still the face of everything, but internally he felt replaceable. That contradiction gnawed at him. And money sat at the center of it. Because whoever controls financial flow controls momentum, controls timelines, controls priorities, controls what gets pursued and what gets dropped. Harry started noticing that when he expressed hesitation, the machine didn't slow. It adjusted around him. That adjustment didn't feel collaborative. It felt adaptive, as if the system could function whether he was fully engaged or not. That realization is terrifying in a marriage built on unity, because unity implies mutual dependence, and mutual dependence requires shared power. Harry began questioning whether that balance still existed. Not angrily, quietly. He didn't accuse, he observed. And observation, over time, becomes evidence. People say he started tracking how often his instincts were overridden, not dismissed outright, redirected, framed as less strategic, less marketable, less necessary. That framing chips away at self-trust, because when your instincts are consistently deprioritized, you start doubting them, and Harry had already spent years doubting himself. That doubt was familiar, too familiar. It echoed his past, being told what's best for him, being protected from his own judgment, being managed for optics. He thought he'd escaped that life. Now, parts of it felt uncomfortably close again. Here's an important nuance. No one says this dynamic was intentional. Intent matters less than impact. And the impact was this. Harry felt like his value was increasingly tied to performance, to productivity, to output. That's a dangerous place for any marriage, because marriages aren't businesses. And when they start functioning like one, intimacy erodes, disagreements shift tone, they become negotiations. What's the ROI? What's the risk? What's the upside? Those questions have their place, but not when you're talking about your life. Harry didn't want to be optimized. He wanted to be understood. That gap widened. And with isolation already in play, he had fewer outlets to process it. So he internalized again. He began asking himself questions he'd avoided before. What happens if I step back? Who benefits? Who loses? And more importantly, who am I if I stop? Those questions didn't have comforting answers, because stopping would destabilize more than finances. It would destabilize narratives, public ones, private ones. And narratives carry power. Harry had helped build the narrative of resilience, reinvention, defiance. Walking away from that narrative, especially midstream, felt dangerous. But continuing it at the cost of his peace felt worse. That's the bind. And money intensified it. Because financial entanglements don't just end when feelings change. They linger, they complicate, they raise stakes. Every decision becomes heavier. Every disagreement carries future implications. Harry wasn't just weighing emotional outcomes. He was weighing consequences. For his children, for his reputation, for his ability to live quietly if he ever wanted to. Those considerations pushed him further inward. And inward thinking, without external grounding, becomes rigid. People say Harry started drawing mental lines. Things he would no longer agree to. Projects he would no longer champion. Battles he would no longer fight. Those boundaries weren't announced. They were enforced quietly. And that enforcement created friction. Because boundaries disrupt systems built on flexibility. Suddenly, timelines slipped. Plans stalled. Momentum slowed. And when momentum slows, pressure increases. That pressure wasn't always directed at Harry. Sometimes it manifested as urgency. We need to move forward. We can't lose momentum. This is bigger than us. But Harry no longer believed bigger was better. He believed smaller was safer. And safety had become his priority. That shift in values is profound. because marriages survive change when values evolve together. They fracture when values diverge. Harry's values were pivoting toward containment, toward simplicity, toward control over his own time and energy. Others around him still valued expansion, reach, impact, visibility. Those aren't compatible directions, not without compromise. And compromise, in this case, had already felt lopsided. One detail insiders mention stands out. Harry began asking about contingencies. What if deals ended? What if revenue streams dried up? What if public sentiment shifted again? Those aren't pessimistic questions. They're protective ones. And protection often signals preparation. Preparation for separation. Not necessarily divorce, but disentanglement. Harry wanted to know what independence would actually look like. Not rhetorically, logistically. That's a significant mental shift, because people who see themselves as permanently embedded don't ask about exit ramps. They assume continuity. Harry was no longer assuming continuity. That realization alone would have alarmed anyone paying attention, but few were, because again, silence masked the shift. Publicly, everything looked fine. Internally, Harry was recalculating, and recalculation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, it just changes priorities. The emotional weight of money in this situation wasn't about greed. It was about autonomy. Harry didn't want to feel beholden, not to institutions, not to brands, not even to shared ventures that no longer felt aligned. He wanted the option to choose. And options require separation, at least mentally. That separation deepened the emotional distance in the marriage, because when one partner starts imagining life apart, even hypothetically, the bond changes. It becomes conditional, fragile, provisional, and that provisional state creates anxiety on both sides. Attempts to reassert control emerged, not overtly, through urgency, through emphasis on stakes, through reminders of what could be lost, but reminders of loss don't strengthen resolve. They create resentment. Harry didn't want to be motivated by fear. He'd lived his life under fear. Fear of loss, fear of press, fear of history repeating itself. Now he wanted something different, peace. And peace felt incompatible with the financial ecosystem his life had become. That's when the word divorce stopped being purely emotional. It became structural, a way to untangle, not just feelings, but systems. That realization is heavy, because divorce isn't just an ending, it's a reconfiguration of power. And power shifts rarely happen quietly. Harry knew that, which is why he didn't move impulsively. He observed, measured, let the implications sink in, and the implications were stark. Leaving wouldn't just change his personal life. It would disrupt narratives, revenue, alliances. It would anger some, terrify others, expose fault lines long hidden. And that exposure was inevitable once financial control came into question. Because money doesn't just reveal priorities, it reveals loyalties. And those loyalties, once tested, don't always hold. By the end of this phase, Harry had reached a sobering conclusion. He couldn't reclaim his autonomy without breaking something. And breaking something this complex would require precision, timing, silence, preparation. Because once the first move was made, there would be no undoing it. And the next move wouldn't come from emotion. It would come from strategy. Because when money and power collide with identity, the fallout isn't personal anymore. It's structural. And the structure was already cracking. But the biggest shock wasn't that Harry was preparing for independence. It was who noticed first, and how that person would use the information. Because the next chapter isn't about money. It's about leverage, and how one quiet discovery would shift the balance completely. The conversation changed the moment the children came up. Not hypothetically, not philosophically, practically. And that's where chapter 5 begins. Because nothing strips illusions faster than parenthood. You can argue about careers. You can compromise on homes. You can survive disagreements about money. But when the conversation turns to children, how they're raised, where they grow up, what they're exposed to, everything sharpens. Suddenly, the stakes aren't emotional, they're generational. According to people close to the situation, discussions about the children had always existed. That wasn't new. What was new was the tone. What had once been framed as shared protection started to feel like opposing visions, and those visions weren't easily reconciled. One centered on privacy, stability, and retreat. The other